Great. Thank you so much. I actually think we'll begin with Laura. Is that right?
Yes.
We'll have Laura give us an overview of Zooming to the Border, the collective. And Laura, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. We're very happy that you guys have joined us. This discussion is going to be very important because of what's happening right now with immigration, with the end of Title 42 and other issues that are affecting the migrant community in here in the US, and also those that are coming to the US. I want to tell you a little bit of history of the Zooming to the Border Collective. We're a group of volunteer activists, NGO workers, journalists, lawyers, and researchers determined to correct, disclose, and publicize the narratives about human rights and environmental conditions in both sides of the border, the US and Mexico. Because of the limitations of COVID-19 in 2020, that's when we started, we named our group, we were planning to go to the border and actually travel in a caravan to the border and talk to different leaders that were doing work around human rights on both sides of the border. But then COVID happened and we couldn't do it. So then we named our collective, our group, Zooming to the Border for Human Rights. And we began to host topical panels made up of people who live and work along the border, narrating the realities of their own lived experience. Each informs our virtual audiences about issues and events in their local region. So that's how we started, and we've been doing it, like I said, since 2020. And we're very happy to have this panel and to start talking about the issue of climate change and migration. And we're very honored to have the speakers that we're going to have today, and our facilitator is going to be Amali Howard. And wow, I read her bio and it's amazing. We are so happy to have you, Amali. She is the founder and executive director of Climate-Refugee. She has extensive global experience in refugee protection, refugee resettlement, and enforced migration and displacement contexts. Having worked globally for numerous NGOs, the UN Refugee Agency, and the US Refugee Admissions Program. Years of interviewing refugees fleeing conflict afforded her the chance to hear their stories of their stories and also of fleeing climate change refugees. Through this, Climate Refugees was born. And of course, we're gonna put her bio in the chat or the link so you can read more about her, because she's so young, but she has such an amazing history and experience. So thank you, Amali. And I forgot to say that I'm Laura Garcia. I'm the editor of El Tribuno del Pueblo, a bilingual publication that focuses on the human rights of migrants and immigration workers. Thank you. Amali, take it.
Laura, thank you so much. That's really kind. First thing I have to say is I'm not that young, but I really appreciate that. No, I meant that. I meant that as a joke. Well, it's really my immense honor to facilitate this discussion. It's thanks to, friends of friends here. The wonderful Mr. Pedro Rios invited me here because of, I think we all have a common, goal, don't we? I think we have academics, we have journalists, we have activists, advocates, we have people working in various areas on a very similar topic here. And where climate change, immigration, border policy, security policy, asylum, refugees, migrants, these are all sort of coalescing and intersecting in not that very positive ways. So I am very honored to be able to facilitate this conversation, as I've said. So before I turn it over to our very esteemed panelists, I've been asked to sort of just provide a few remarks framing the topic. Because I come to this topic from the context of refugees, migrants and asylum seekers, mostly refugees who I've worked with in situations of conflict, violence, forced displacement. But I think it's very important to note that in that context that I've been working in for nearly 20 years now, I've never met one person who ever said to me that they fled for one reason, this reason and this reason only. Situations of forced displacement, whatever the eventual reason that one discloses, which I think you'll hear our panelists say, are often multi-causal. And climate change is a very good topic in which to dissect that phenomenon. Migration is a right, and it's also a right to not migrate. And in the context of climate change, I think we are narrowing the space in which those two sort of rights can coexist. I'm not sure that they've ever really coexisted with any harmony, because we have no international framework of global governance for migrants or migration. We do have an international global governance framework for refugees, and that's framed by the 1951 Refugee Convention, which comes out of World War II, which in the beginning had geographic limitations that were limited only to people fleeing World War II out of Europe. And it also had a time limitation where it was not meant to be still in existence 70 plus years later. So in 1967, we had an additional protocol that was written, and most countries signed and ratified, not all have. I mentioned this idea of ratification and an ascension to a treaty, which is how we have international law, right? Because many of the countries that actually host the largest bodies of refugees in the world are not parties to the Refugee Convention. So it just goes to show you how sort of sacrosanct this convention is, because it is customary international law. And a person is a refugee who flees their country, crosses an international boundary, and is, by pure definitional basis of the convention, fleeing persecution. Persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group. You'll note climate change is nowhere really within that. That said, there are plenty of examples today, especially in the Central American context that is playing out right here at the US southern border, where there are what we call sort of like nexus grounds, where this persecution element, and so take, for example, political opinion, environmental defenders coming from Central America, membership in a particular social group would be an environmental defender, for example, ethnicity, that's race. If you're indigenous and you have decades of human rights violations being perpetrated upon you on the basis of that ethnicity and race, and you have issues that our panelists will get into of land tenure, meets climate change, meets multinational corporations, meets global corporations, and about seven countries that are historically responsible, and even today, for the global greenhouse gas emissions that have kept us in this climate crisis. There is culpability here. There is a lack of political will. And I will say, not a lack of political will to act, because there's plenty of political will to keep people out, but there's a lack of political will to protect people. And then when we do protect people, we protect people indiscriminately and also disproportionately to the crises that are playing out. I have absolutely nothing but welcome for the response that the global community has had for Ukrainians, because I've spent my whole life, both as a professional and as a person, advocating for those rights. But I just want to ask the world, why are they not equal for everybody? Because Ukraine, we're only a few short weeks or months away from Ukrainians themselves are going to be persecuted and not wanted because this is the refugee context and this is generally how it goes. And all of a sudden you'll find that Ukrainians are othered as well, and they're not going to be as white as they are right now. So whether we're discriminating people on the basis of race, socioeconomic status, geography, class, caste, power, these are the ways in which this sort of indiscriminate power dynamic is playing out. Very quickly, because statistics are important, but statistics can underwhelm the human impacts of all this. I'll just say that it's, like I said, it's very difficult to know to what extent and how climate change is driving migration, because it's a multi-causal issue. And it impacts poverty, it impacts food insecurity, it impacts, political violence, it destabilizes societies. Our panelists will get into this. There's slow onset impacts of climate change, which is like drought, climate variability, land degradation, water insecurity, etc. There's sudden onset impacts of climate change, which are hurricanes, natural disasters. This term is becoming a sort of obfuscated. We all know we all know
about this, but it's very controversial because of the.
Okay. In 2020, 30.6 million people were displaced by climate-related disasters or weather-related disasters, which is more than 3 times the amount of people who were displaced by conflict or violence. Now, that was internal displacement, and most of the climate displacement we're seeing right now is, we have numbers for, are internal, and they're within the context of these sudden onset disasters, because the slow onset climate change impacts are very much harder to sort of pinpoint and specifically, point to. I will say, though, one more statistic that's important: 90% of refugees today, those that fall within that convention definition I mentioned, do come from climate change vulnerable countries. So we do have a disconnect with our legal definitions and the dynamics of displacement today, and the political will about what we choose to care about. So that's sort of the framing of sort of the global overview of the topic. I'm going to let our very, very well-informed panelists talk to you about the Central America-Mexico corridor and what exactly is playing out here at the US southern border. And we're gonna begin with a global overview of border security and the issue as it relates to border security, surveillance, and enforcement, with someone who I respect and admire very much, Mr. Todd Miller. He's a journalist, he's an author, he is the author of this particular book that I highly recommend everybody read. He's written many books, but this one is called Storming the Wall: Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security. Todd does incredible work right from the border through the Border Chronicle as well, reporting. So I'm going to let Todd take it there, and I will put his whole bio in the chat as we speak. After Todd, we will have remarks from José Artiga, who is who's going to speaking about the perspective from Honduras, possibly also El Salvador. And I'll come back to Jose with his bio so that we don't kind of forget everybody and I read everybody all at the same time. So Todd, I'll let you take it away from there. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Amali. It's really great to see you, for one, and great to be here. I'm honored to be here with you today and with the collective and on this panel. And many thanks to Laura and Pedro too for help, and everyone else who helped organize this event. Yeah, I guess I wanted to start by reading this. Well, what I basically want to talk about in my brief time here is the kind of the security paradigm, or the so-called border security paradigm around climate. And I think one place to start, many potential places, is a Pentagon assessment from 2003. And this was assessment called I think it's called an abrupt climate change scenario and its implications for United States security. And I just want to read a little bit of it, just a couple sentences. And it says, so they're looking at a worst case scenario. This is the US Pentagon. It's 2003. And they say that the United States and Australia are likely to build defensive fortresses around their countries because they have the resources and reserves to achieve self-sufficiency. Now, mind you, this is a direct quote from this document. And then it says, borders will be strengthened around the country, and this is, again, direct quote, to hold back unwanted starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands, in parentheses, an especially severe problem, Mexico and South America. And so I wanted to, and mind you, and that I always think, a mission of Central America in that quote makes me just think that the authors of this report were geographically challenged, but in that they meant to include Central America. But I wanted to start there mainly because it was 2003, right? That's the year that the Department of Homeland Security was created. The Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. All of this is created in that year. Of course, from the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, was before that. But my point is that even though when you look at DHS and its priority mission from the start as being counterterrorism, this sort of climate narrative was there, right? And you could see right from the get-go, like you look at the massive fortification of the border and immigration enforcement apparatus that really began, I would argue, before then. But let's just take the DHS period and look at how the floodgates of budgets, right, just poured into DHS, and of course CBP, ICE. You could see like the Secure Fence Act of 2006, which built 700, nearly 650 miles of walls and barriers. The SBI Net program, which brought in all this technology and this creation of a virtual wall, and what I would call the surveillance apparatus, which now manifests with more and more robots. I'm sure people have seen those robotic dogs that CBP has been showing off in the last little bit, as well as hiring surge of Border Patrol agents, really literally doubling the Border Patrol from 10,000 to 20,000. I think between beginning of the Bush administration and then ending in the Obama administration. So it went up to 21,000 agents. And mind you, from 4,000 if you go back to 1994, so it quintupled, right? So you're looking at this dramatic fortification. And I wanted to align it with that 2003 Pentagon assessment. And even though like the justification was counterterror, you go a little bit further and you come to this report by the national intelligence community called I'm going to forget the name of it. Dang it. I think it's called Climatic Cataclysm. But I have a quote from in Climatic Cataclysm, if I have it right, I think it's about right. It was a report by the National Intelligence Council looking at security, quote unquote, security and climate change. Right. And then in the National Intelligence Council was supposed to look at it as you would a military planner. And they explicitly say it right at the beginning. A military planner needs 30 years. You need 30 years to figure out what to put on the quote unquote battlefield. And so they did assessments from looking at different possibilities in the future, like 1.5 degrees Celsius centigrade rise in temperature by 2040, or 2.6 by 2040. One quick I just want to read one quick, so you just get this point that the Pentagon assessment is still, that sort of analysis is still very, very much the analysis within the U.S. federal government around this. And it says, this is from Leon Firth, who was a former advisor to Al Gore, and he wrote that border problems, beyond the possibility of control, will overwhelm U.S. capability. Border problems will overwhelm U.S. capabilities beyond the possibility of control, except by drastic methods, and perhaps not even then. So those are I'm just reading that to give the kind of idea of what's going on in the upper echelons of the federal government, how they're looking at climate. And then to go forward a little bit more, 2010, and that's the year, climate is looked at for the first time, I believe, as a national security issue. And the Obama administration then issues to all the departments that, okay, look at it. We got to look at climate as a national security issue. And that includes, of course, the Department of Homeland Security. I should have mentioned too, in 2008, and that was the year as well that, and this goes along with all the caveats that Amali was bringing up around, climate-induced migration. But that's when the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center was calculating more or less approximately 24 million people per year worldwide were being displaced due to environmental reasons, heavily influenced by the changing climate. So all that's coming into issue. And so when the Obama administration declared it a climate as a national security issue, well, then DHS, of course, then began to do some climate assessments, and they did a climate adaptation plan. And you could look into that. All of this is online. And the climate adaptation plan, of course, starts looking at climate through the DHS mission. The Dhs Mission is 5 points: border security, immigration enforcement, cybersecurity, counterterrorism, and critical infrastructure. So that's how they're looking. They began to look at climate change, displacement. If you look in the documents that DHS was producing, they will talk about droughts in Central America. They'll talk about weather in Central America as potential factors for displacement. In other words, they know, right? The Department of Homeland Security knows. And this was then reconfirmed how much they know in 2018 when Customs and Border Protection pretty much announced that they were seeing people leaving Guatemala and different areas of Guatemala due to what they called food insecurity. And then if you look in those places, those are places that were getting hit pretty hard by droughts that were in those areas. And so all of this, what's going to, what I would argue is a paradigm around climate and quote unquote security and border fortification. And one telling thing is if you look at the numbers, and I helped write a report last fall called the Global Climate Report, and it looked at the highest emitters in the world and the highest emitting countries and how much they're putting towards border and immigration enforcement versus how much they're putting towards climate action. And the top emitter, United States, going back to the Industrial Revolution, 30%. And I bet I could throw out how much do you think, what proportion do you think of the US federal government funds is going to border and immigration enforcement versus climate action? Climate action meaning funding that could actually help people not have to leave, right? Like help people in certain areas withstand sea level rise, or at least, there's all kinds of things that could be done with climate action or climate action funds. But between 2013 and 2019, and I'll end I know I'm at that end of my section, so I'm going to end really quickly. The ratio was 13-1 in favor of border and immigration enforcement to climate action. In other words, that is the climate adaptation plan by the United States and many other countries, including the historic emitters, to build more borders, to build more walls. There's more than 70 border walls around the world now, up from 15 since 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. So these walls, it's a walled world that we're looking at. That's increasingly, I would argue, this adaptation plan for climate. And the final thing I just wanted to mention, those sorts of assessments that I began with, if you go to the National Intelligence Council's annual threat assessment from 2021, they use the word migration 18 times. They pose migration as a threat in there. And in that threat assessment, they also mentioned very specific events that happen in Central America, such as the hurricanes of late 2020 and droughts that have happened and COVID, right? And all that together. And instead of looking at it like Amali in terms of, looking at in terms of refugee status or anything like that, the way that it's defined is put as a threat, which only makes me think the paradigm of increased borderfication we'll have in what we'll have going forward into the future. Thank you.
Wow, Todd, thank you so much. I think I'll have so many follow-up questions, and I think maybe our audience will as well. Maybe if I can ask you really quick, and maybe it's also something for you to think about as we hear everyone else speak. How exactly? I mean, we're hearing now about Title 42 that's going to be lifted, in May. I got the date listed here somewhere in my notes. But we're also hearing about all this resistance now from both parties in the US, which is not unusual because this is across administrations, right? There's been this reticence at the US border for arrivals. And you're seeing both Democrats and Republicans say that maybe the CDC should continue to enforce Title 42. And you're seeing the CDC say, well, no, because that's not really the case, and finally actually push back and say that this isn't a public health concern. And at the same time, you've got this now, Ukrainians are exempt from Title 42. So, that's one way to view it. And then there's this, what you're, I've read your work and what you just said as like, the security apparatus sees migration as a threat. And in my work, there's this almost false invisible line between, there's migration, voluntary migration and involuntary migration. And somewhere within that continuum is what we are supposed to somehow classify as forced migration. And that's where this all gets murky and gray. And, so this is really more of a rhetorical, like guiding talking point, Todd, that, I might put to all the panelists, because I think it really frames the conversation, right? How not just the US government, but all these countries, it's like, why is it that migration is voluntary for certain people who want to come here for, poverty reduction or looking for a job, when what you just heard Todd say, very clear that it's not really regarded that way in the security apparatus fully. So yeah, I guess I don't have a question, Todd, but except to say that I want to put that out there for us to think about, for everyone to think about. And now let me go back to my facilitator hat and introduce our other fantastic speaker. Mr. José Artiga is the founder of the Shar Foundation and has served as the organization's executive director since its inception in 1995. He's also a longtime human, environmental, and immigrant rights advocate in the United States and in Central America. He is going to be speaking to us today about the situation, exactly what we're talking about from the perspective of Honduras and probably El Salvador as well. It's my honor to introduce you, Mr. Artiga, and please take it away. Thank you so much. And I will put your bio in the chat. And lest I forget, we do have Spanish translation, and I'm sure most of you have discovered that by now. But if not, you obviously see it here on your bottom buttons. And then we'll also have time for Q&A, as I've just alluded to. So please do hold your questions or write them down and be prepared for our scintillating conversation. Thank you so much, Jose. Over to you.
Buenos días. And a pleasure to be here, humbled to be here. Thank you, Laura, and all the organizers for putting this wonderful event. I am myself a refugee from El Salvador that came in the early 80s. And El Salvador is a very unique place. It's the smallest country, one of the smallest country in the whole continent. Within 3 hours, you are hitting the borders. If you are driving, very tiny place. But we have, according to the statistics, 30% of our population in the United States. More realistically, will be very close to 50% of the population. In fact, we are the third largest Latino community in the United States. And that is happening now in Honduras. And today I want to introduce you to 3 people. First is Reynaldo, a farmer. The second one is a mother, Orbelina, and they are both in Honduras. And the third one is Antonio and Bella. They are very young and they are here in the United States. Antonio is only for 16 months and Bella is 3 years. And I want you to remember their weight. They are about 24 pounds and 40 pounds. So Reynaldo is a farmer, and wants to be a farmer in the Bahua One. The Bahua One in Honduras is one of the most fertile valleys in the continent. What that means is that if you plant a seed on that soil, it will grow 10 times better than anywhere else in the continent. A couple of years ago, Hurricane Eta and Iota hit Honduras, and Reynaldo's squash and vegetable crops were washed away. Not only his house and the baby's toys and all the possessions, but something I have never seen before. He said, my soil was washed away. This very beautiful, fertile soil is now a sandy beach that is not good to plant anything. Just skipping that, he wants to stay in Honduras and he wants to plant, but climate change kind of remove those possibilities. There's more about Reynaldo. He's also a member of the committee to defend the rivers against a mining company in Guapinol, and there has been a big attack on the environmentalists, but I will not elaborate more on that. The second person I want you to meet is Orbelina. Orbelina, had a big family, and because of climate change and because of persecution of environmentalists, in a very short period of time, 15 members of her family, 15 members of her family are now in Palo Alto, here in the Bay Area in California. One by one came because they couldn't stay anymore in Honduras. And we, as an institution, the Shar Foundation supports the right of migrate, but we support the right to stay, which is a very unique right. Imagine all the people in Puerto Rico living, to the United States, or all the people in Nevada going to California and to New York. But there are a good number of people that do not want to migrate for many reasons, including that you cannot find torrejas or you cannot find jocotes and miel for Holy Week, here in the United States, the way you find them in your community and the way you have these networks of support and friends and that. So Orbelina's family is now here in Palo Alto. And the third group I want you to meet is Antonio, 16 months old, and Bella, 3 years old. And I imagined carrying Antonio, these are my relatives, carrying them for 1 mile. And I just couldn't do it. They were way too heavy and too uncomfortable. And of course, at very short time, they start crying because they needed this and they needed that. And you can make that more complicated if you do it under the sun, like at midday. Now imagine the people in the caravans coming from Honduras, 5,000, 9,000 people joining the caravan with babies, some of them sick, and not walking for 1 mile, but working for several thousand miles on that journey north. Very difficult, at some point you will imagine, are they crazy, or the push factors are so strong that they are going to risk those babies getting sick and maybe dying on the way. So the right to stay is very powerful, and I end with 2 very short things. One is, we demand many things from the government, we should, but we as citizens here in the United States can do a lot to support the people that want to stay. So we have, as the Shar Foundation, have supported an effort called Vamos a la Milpa. And the milpa is seen as production or planting all the crops that you might need to produce food. And producing food implies, reclaiming the land like Zapata, Tierra en Libertad. Is very revolutionary, because now you are not depending on Walmart. You are not depending on the fast food places to bring food to your table, but you yourself will produce it. Imagine, this is a very indigenous concept, the Lencas, the Mayas, the Aztecs, planting, not only food crops, but planting flower. I have my flowers here to show you, but also planting medicine plants. You don't need to go to the store to, get some of those goodies. So planting food is an effort that we are supporting as a way to legitimize the right to stay, and people are doing it. Last, I want to invite you to join a delegation. It's wonderful to meet via Zoom. It's wonderful to get emails and this and that, but there's nothing like walking with the people. So this July and this December, we will organize a delegation, and we have organized 10,080 delegates over the last 41 years. So we have quite of an experience, and we'll do our very, very best that you will be healthy, you will be safe, and you will return to expand, those learnings that you will do there. But the power of walking with the people, and we will be planting with them, we will be attending their milpas and their corn and their beans and their flowers. And it's a wonderful way. It's also a positive thing. Sometimes in our work, of course, we are complaining and bad news and bad news. These are good news. This is a positive, thing. You can also plant your own milpa in your backyard, here in the United States, to have that feeling of what it means to get your hands on the land and get that healing power of Mother Earth. I end here, and you can also go to our website. That I'll put it on the chat. But very honored and very happy that this learning and sharing is taking place. Muchas gracias.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak more about the right to stay. This is something that I think policymakers need to hear more of. And I think the work you're doing is fabulous. So looking forward to talking more about that. Thank you so much for that. So we will now move on to our next panelist, who is Dr. Jorge Cuéllar. And I apologize, I do not speak Spanish, but I'm trying to make sure I put the accents on the right places there. So Dr. Cuéllar is a Salvadoran-born and Los Angeles-raised interdisciplinary scholar, appointed assistant professor of Latin American, Latinx, and Caribbean studies at Dartmouth College. He received his PhD in American Studies from Yale University. His work emerges from critical analysis of his own family history, in addition to close collaboration with communities across El Salvador, from bus cooperatives, community elders, water defenders, and indigenous groups. I will put the rest of his bio in the chat, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you, Dr. Cuéllar. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Amali, and gracias to Pedro, Laura, Ilana, and the rest of the Zooming to the Border Collective for this kind invitation. So I was tasked with describing and historicizing a little bit about what CAFTA is. And so I wrote this thing up, and so I'll just read it to you. So the problem of food, water, and dignified living is at the heart of most past and present contemporary problems. And it's the grounds upon which migration is decided, the kind of medium through which displacement takes place. These afflictions are today an acute expression of the ecological crisis as it impacts lived experience, one that is determinant in the making of climate-induced migration today. Climate change can appear, as José told us, as droughts, hurricanes, floods, and other forms of environmental erosions. For example, El Niño's intensification is one expected symptom of climate imbalance. These are, in some sense, disruptive events that force society to look in the mirror, to address disaster in all of its political and cultural fullness. But disaster, as the Equipo Maíz collective of El Salvador like to say, are not natural. Briefly, let me offer some notes on the real disaster, CAFTA, and how it sets the stage for today's ongoing climate conflict and environmental stress. And here I deliberately called it a conflict to underscore the asymmetry of destruction and harm, as well as to think how we might advocate for climate as an unambiguous factor in migration. So the Central America Free Trade Agreement includes the nations of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. It was put into effect in the years from 2000 to 2004 to 2005, and that for the country of El Salvador specifically cannot be divorced from the experience of dollarization. Dollarization, for those who don't know, was an economic process of currency transition that took place in 2001 under the presidency of Francisco Flores, which led to replacing the national currency, the colón, a currency that was in use since 1892, to the US dollar. The reasons for dollarization are multiple, but one of the often cited reasons was to control inflation. But in my view, dollarization was an elite-led decision that was largely about making global markets accessible to national elites. It inaugurated the present moment of economic inequality. Starvation wages went alongside starvation conditions. The US dollar instantly led to the depression of real wages across the country, decimating the purchasing power of ordinary people. For both urban and rural workers alike, wages lagged behind the changed economic reality around them. For example, the price of the basic basket of goods, right? Beans, rice, cheese, flour were raised to US dollar equivalent seemingly overnight, while wages struggled to catch up. To this day, one could even argue that Salvadoran wages haven't yet caught up from the economic shock of dollarization. To this day, neoliberal economics has not shown interest in squaring the dollarized economy and those increasing costs of living with the subsistence economics that once organized around the use of colón, especially in the informal marketplace and in the realm of peasant agriculture. Now, it is well known that CAFTA decimated the agricultural sector throughout Central America. It was a catastrophe. It marks the start of a policy articulated neoliberalism with the express leadership and economic interest of the United States and Canada. What did this yield? Well, for one, it accelerated the ecological crisis in the region that was still emerging from a war, which is another kind of environmental disaster, and that helped to solidify an export oligarchy contrary to the land reforms that were sought via the armed struggle of the 1980s. CAFTA helped landed elites, large planters, and transnational corporations to monopolize the best land and resources. Today, this is happening in the Bajo Juan, as José mentioned. It helped them to capture the bulk of development aid and help them have access to easy credit. CAFTA, which arrived on the scene a little over 10 years after the close of the 1992 Civil War in El Salvador, generated a world characterized by unpredictability. CAFTA spelled a new world for peasants where life and death was a daily variable. In short, this policy squashed the demographic majorities of the country, small farmers and subsistence agriculturalists. These groups were now forced to compete in a CAFTA economy against US growers. Here, US subsidized corn, for instance, cheaply grown through mechanized northern agriculture, snuffed out local production as small farmers could not compete or keep up with those competitive prices and the vast quantities that were flooding the Central American market. So effectively bankrupted, this created a landless class in El Salvador and throughout Central America that had to look for employment in cities, leading to one of the major population booms of the major capital cities of the region. Guatemala City expanded, San Salvador expanded, Tegucigalpa, San Pedro Sula exploded to look for employment in the cities. So this came as no surprise, similar to the experience of NAFTA in Mexico, where you have this tragedy happening some years before that decimated subsistence agriculture and transformed family farmers into migrants, a kind of surplus labor on the move. And Anne will pick up on NAFTA in a minute. So CAFTA then created captive markets for US agricultural overproduction, where Central American nations promised to consume US made goods. In this period, Central American nations imported these foodstuffs and killed local farming. So as the story goes, Central American nations became majority importers of the US after CAFTA was implemented. They became net agriculture importers of corn, of rice, of beans produced elsewhere. So CAFTA created this labor surplus and forced people into the cities. And here, CAFTA also had a built-in response, which was to capture these people moving into the cities for factory jobs. And here you have the phenomenon of maquilas and free trade zones that largely produce textiles and small electronics. So these maquilas, as we all know, force people to work in terrible sweatshop-like conditions. And these miserable conditions weren't conducive to anybody wanting to stick around. So many of these folks, became migrants themselves. So these miserable environments were a product of little to no worker protections and political concessions that were given to transnational corporations who were supposedly helping to spur country development. However, the maquilas themselves were unable to absorb the vast numbers of unemployed persons, which led to massive waves of outmigration throughout the 2000s. For other people, CAFTA also meant the loss of their subsistence lands and created other mechanisms of internal and intra-regional displacement. So people from El Salvador going to Honduras, people from Honduras going to Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. Where many moved further and further also into the hillsides as a way to continue some of these subsistence practices, but on worse soil, because the best soil was being picked up and accumulated by corporations. So at its root, environmental destruction is the prime mover of most displacement from Central America. CAFTA, or said otherwise, was a form of structural adjustment that emphasized production for export over production for local needs, and widened inequality and the life-sustaining capacity of these countries, where the intensive exploitation of nature for profit was primary, and the sustainable use of these resources a kind of tertiary concern. CAFTA is a vehicle for asserting the interests of transnational corporate and the finance sector over and above the needs of ordinary people. So, and the legacies of CAFTA are still present. It was really a kind of cruel reality that it inaugurated for Central Americans. Deadly pesticides, for instance, that were banned in the US were exported to Central America for local use, where they did and continue to poison thousands of laborers every year. Much of the land, the water table, and the food chains that are linked to these are now contaminated by the use of toxic inputs to maintain these artificial high yields. All the rivers in El Salvador today are polluted beyond repair. These unchecked practices of corporations have continued on for decades and into the present, where in fact CAFTA offered special corporate protections to enable industries to freely dump these toxic chemicals into the environment, or suck up the water from underneath the feet of communities with little to no consequences. These special protections also allowed corporations to sue communities who stood in the way of their profiteering. So to this day, corporations do little for cleanup, for compensating people who have been aggrieved by these exploitative practices. Transnational businesses, spurred by a radically deregulated transnational economic policy, which is CAFTA, has left chemical waste, residues, and poison in the soil. in the water and in the biosphere more broadly that today impact the health, the habitability, and the well-being of Central Americans. And to deepen the Salvadoran example a little bit, 1 in 10 people in El Salvador have access to safe drinking water. There's chronic shortages. It's one of the most deforested countries in the hemisphere. Honduras, for example, has high incidence of waterborne diseases, malnutrition, and continue to be a sizable percentage of yearly deaths. In Guatemala, the vast majority of migrants right now are from indigenous communities who are being displaced by hydroelectric development, by new forms of resource extraction, to which CAFTA still serves as the economic policy backdrop. To close, CAFTA rewrote the rules on how subsistence, economic productivity, and land use is supposed to take place. There are no easy answers here, but what we do know is that environmental leaders and activists have long articulated paths forward. The first of which is to repeal CAFTA and to pass laws that make unignorable the subsistence of local communities over the needs of transnational capital. For as long as the search for extreme profit margins continue, extreme deforestation, dumping, and ecological destruction will continue in Central America, leading to new cohorts of climate refugees. Thank you.
Wow.
Wow, thank you so much, Jorge. That's incredible. I would love to, in the Q&A, get into possibly the need to link the corporations that are so complicit in all these violations, really, that are, I suppose, legitimized through CAFTA, and connecting it to then the climate injustice, the fossil fuel, their fossil fuel record, and bringing that whole sort of like unity together, given that, as I said in the opening remarks, there are about 100 corporations really too that really need to be brought out into the forefront in terms of how much they are really holding the whole world hostage, really, in this climate challenge. So from CAFTA, we are going to move now to NAFTA. I'm sure something we all have also heard of, and speak to, and hear from our last panelist, Dr. López, who's the founder and executive director of Center for Farmworker Families, a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the living and working conditions of migrant farm worker families on the Central Coast and in Mexico. Dr. López was named Woman of the Year by Assemblyman Mark Stone for the 29th Assembly District of California. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. López and put her bio also in the chat. Thank you so much for being here. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you. It's truly an honor to be with all of you and to listen to your information and to recognize how timely it is. It's so important that this information is out there and people become aware. And I started working on my PhD many years ago, and my task was to find out what the impact of the North American Free Trade Agreement was on the subsistence and small producer farms of West Central Mexico. And so I first of all studied what life was like prior to NAFTA for these different farming areas, and learned that the corn, bean, and squash intercrop, or milpa, was a subsistence type of crop that had sustained families in the area and in Mexico and to Latin America for, we think, between 7,000 and 9,000 years. And the subsistence farmers continued this milpa practice, and many scientific studies were done on the relationships between these plants, showing that if you grow these kind of intercrops, you can have much higher corn yields than if you grow monocultures. And Mexico at the time protected these subsistence farmers from the invasion of foreign corn by instituting tariffs at the border. So in other words, if you were a Iowa farmer and you had corn to sell in Mexico, you'd load up your truck, arrive at the border, it would get weighed, and then you would be charged a tariff that usually was so high, you'd see that it wasn't worth it to go into Mexico and sell your corn, and you'd turn around and go back. And in Mexico, the government had outposts where they purchased about a third to a half of each campesino's yield per year. And they put this corn in what they called conosupos, or sort of like small stores where they could sell it to people for below market prices. And that way Mexico was able to mitigate poverty. The NAFTA, the goal of NAFTA was to get rid of the tariffs at the border, quote, free trade. And that happened as a result of the US becoming the dominant corn producer in the world. Now, excuse me, Mexico has such a huge variety of different ecosystems that these subsistence farmers over hundreds, thousands of years were able to refine the genetics to match that particular ecosystem. And Mexico became the repository for corn genetics for the entire world. So anybody who was growing corn and had a problem with their corn would go to Mexico, find an ecosystem that had a similar type from where they came, and cross their corn with the Mexican corn, and that usually solved the problem. And since corn, rice, and wheat are the three grains that support all of humanity, this was critical for people's well-being all around the world. So with NAFTA, the goal was to get rid of the tariffs at the border. The people who designed NAFTA, who remain very obscure, I researched for months trying to find out who specifically these people were, and came up with nothing. But they decided that these subsistence farmers in Mexico were growing corn, quote, inefficiently, and that they should be run off their land into the industries at the border, the maquiladoras, and their labor used there. And the US should be the corn producer for Mexico. So in order to have that scenario happen, you have to get rid of the tariffs at the border. And originally, the plan was to have a 15-year phase-out period of the tariffs so that the farmers could find alternative employment. That was the original plan. In fact, all the tariffs were gone within 30 months. And I was in Mexico at the time when all the tariffs were dropped, and there was massive confusion in the countryside. People said there were problems with the government. They didn't understand why a gallon of gas, or a kilo of gas, whatever, had doubled in price. There was just mass confusion, and there was no information given to any of the villagers that I visited about what had happened. So what happened is literally overnight, people's income went down to nearly nothing because the US started dumping corn into Mexico in huge quantities. I mean, tons and tons of genetically modified hybrid corn being dumped into Mexico, much cheaper than what the campesinos grew and sold on the marketplace. So undercut the price of the campesino corn, and consequently, the campesinos were left with no income virtually. And they had no money to buy farming implements, doctor visits, quinceañeras, et cetera. And so that left them with three possible solutions. They could either stay on their land and starve with their families. And I visited 2 farms where that was their choice. They said, we've been here generations, we're not leaving. Very sad. Another alternative is to go to a large city and attempt to find work, like what Jorge described. And if you go to Mexico City, you'll see that it is ringed in shanty towns. And if you go in a plane over the city, you can't even see the edge of the city. It's quite a phenomenon because of so many displaced farmers going there to find work and send money home to the farm. And finally, the final choice that affects us here is many decided to make an undocumented border crossing to the United States. So when I started my research visiting these farms and interviewing farm workers who had come from Mexico, what I found was a population in inordinate pain and suffering. I would go into wherever they were living and ask them what I considered to be neutral questions, like, tell me how you farmed in Mexico. And within a half hour, someone in the room would be sobbing. And they would be saying, I miss my children, I miss my family, I miss whoever. So they were what I called economic refugees, and yet there was almost nothing in the newspaper about what I consider a huge humanitarian disaster. Salinas de Gortari estimated that 1 million farmers would leave their land every year for the first 15 years of NAFTA. Where did he expect them to go? And so we had, prior to NAFTA, about 4 million undocumented people in the country. Today we have 11 million. And almost all of those that I have discussed or had discussions with did not want to leave Mexico. They wanted to stay, again, the right to stay. So the people that have come to California in particular most of them are farm workers now. And we have in the state a population of about 60% undocumented farm workers. They live in constant fear of deportation. They stay hidden, especially in the Oaxacan community. Excuse me. They stay hidden in wherever they're living or in the field, and they very seldom go out in groups or in public because, again, they live in constant fear. In the area I live in, near Watsonville, California, I have seen statistics as high as 83% of farm workers that are undocumented. Now, of course, this is a real plus for growers because they have a population of hard workers that fear deportation and fear being blacklisted. So they won't complain about some of the most heinous abuses, which include being exposed to pesticides, even though there are clear regulations about spraying these awful chemicals. The farm workers call me and tell me people are fainting in the field. They're nauseous, they're vomiting, whatever. And then I call the ag commissioner and he sends a group out to investigate, but of course none of them will talk because they're afraid of being deported. And I'm sorry, I have such an issue with this. I don't think anyone who works weeks, months, and years in the field feeding us should be considered undocumented. They do not deserve to live in this kind of fear, and I think it's cruel and inhumane. Now, on the other side of the border, I have not been since the pandemic, but I was there. In fact, I had to fly home because of the pandemic. But in one of the villages that I visited regularly for at least 20 years, Cuquillo, Jalisco, in the high mountains, It went in that 20 years from a pristine, clean air, clean watered community to one that was infested with the genetically modified strains of corn from this country and all the chemicals required to grow them. And prior to 2020, there was no cancer in Cuquillo. And the last time I was there, the children started getting cancer, and cancer of the eyes. One young woman developed bone cancer. She had a leg removed and ultimately died. And this is our legacy. And I was so horrified after doing all this research and putting it all together and eventually writing a book about it, that I gave up my idea of teaching in a university and thought, I need to educate the public. It's not, the public needs to know these policies that create so much suffering in people and are against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I think I've probably used up my time. Is that right? So anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Anne. I was engrossed in everything you were saying, so I wasn't keeping time. So you know, I'm sure I know you have a lot more to say, and you will.
Yes.
I'm also just really thankful to everything that you all said, and also thinking about all the sort of connecting points to all of your wonderful work.
Yeah.
To, you know, and I've seen some questions in the chat now come up as well, and I want to use our time very wisely here to engage us maybe in a short discussion, to sort of connect some of the strings here that I've heard come forth. You know, it's like everything you're saying, Anne, about NAFTA, and Jorge, you've said about CAFTA, you know, and the great point you raised about, in not so long ago, we were making this distinction about economic refugees. And we use these terms to, a term, by the way, that has no legal classification whatsoever, right? And we say economic refugees only as a way to other people and to declassify them, or to like move them into over to the side, to say you don't belong, you have no classification, right? Because economic drivers are not covered as refugees. And at the same time, we, you know, what that really obfuscates is the fact that there's no definition for migrant. And I don't think that's I think that's very much by design, right? I think that when you listen to what you've described, and how the trade imbalance and how agronomy and what Jorge also said about CAFTA, and what Jose had to say about the fact that El Salvador, Jose, if you want to jump in with this, because this is another question I've seen in the panel. I read somewhere that 95% of El Salvador today is pretty much uncultivatable. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that word right, because it just sounds so strange to me to say. But you know, someone here has a question. Then how is climate? You know, what is the land being used for in El Salvador? Which is exactly a great question. So I want to try and bring those 3 points in: NAFTA, CAFTA, what El Salvador looks like, how this is really minimized, how people can live, how they've lived in an indigenous way, which I'm using the word even beyond ethnicity, right? And how that is being eroded, how cultural livelihood is being eroded, how cultural rights that are being eroded. So how do we take all this wonderful knowledge, work, activism that you're all doing, and now move it to the policy level to say, okay, you sort of othered people with the classification of economic refugees. Now we're doing it with the term climate refugees. And we're, and we have to somehow get policymakers to realize that before you did it with economic and trade imbalances, now you're doing it with the climate imbalance, right? How do we now as activists galvanize both these power imbalances to say that you're corrupting the process and eroding like human security and the sovereign right to choose?
That's right.
I'll leave that open to everyone, and Todd, you as well. Maybe that's the best way I can think to sort of bring in all your presentations.
Well, I would say that let's find a way to bring all the issues together. It's like when you have an illness in your foot. It's not only your foot that is in pain. It's the whole body. So we need to see the whole region. Mexico, Central America. Now, for instance, we see refugees coming from Venezuela, from Haiti. So these policies are affecting all of us. So one will be, let's get together. Let's get together and, let's move away from I'm focusing on this country or that country, but see more the region. The second thing is, let's talk to the people that are the most affected. Sometimes we want to believe that we are experts, because, we have a study or because, many reasons, but let's talk to the very barefoot people that are being affected and see how they see it. Because believe me, they are thinking about solutions to these problems day and night. Day and night, they don't sleep, trying to see how their children, will have, what we have in the North. And last one, I would say, let's do actions together. Let's join forces. I put the example of the cables of the Golden Gate Bridge. That cable that holds the bridge, it has 36,000 cables as thick as this tiny little finger. So each of our organizations, can join forces and agree on some things. We might not agree on everything, but we might have a few points of unity and arrive to this together and work with the people. Work with the people. Lastly, I would say, let's work with esperanza. We need to believe that there is a solution, that there is an alternative. It might be just planting a tiny little flower that we water and that we fertilize, organic fertilizer, because we cannot be operating based on fear or based on negativity. We need to bring the spirit of the community that should be positive and imagine a better future. Start imagining, just dreaming. It's like the architect that is just drawing in a piece of paper. It's just a piece of paper, but eventually that drawing becomes a reality. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Anne, please, Anne, go ahead.
I've thought about this for many, many years, and I really think that we need a new economy. The neoliberal economy is not working with a priority on profits over people and the environment. And when we have so many oligarchs addicted to money who are willing to do anything to increase their wealth, we have a real problem, because the extraction of the earth or extraction of materials from the earth, the fact that the extinction of species, we have lost 70% of the world's wild animals since 1970. This is completely unsustainable. And like you say, we are headed for an unlivable world. We need a new economy that prioritizes the environment and people over profits.
Well said. Yeah. Okay, let me move to a couple of questions I see here in the chat. From Gloria here, it says, to all panelists, what do you see as the priority to educate the US public? Also, it's a very broad question. Also talk about remesas sent to homelands from undocumented in the US. Okay, let me narrow that down just a little bit to say, you know, I know that there's so many things that we could pick there, but maybe to narrow it a little bit to like where we have opportunities at the moment, right? Given that Title 42 is lifting, given that the Biden administration has, I would say just on paper only, for all intents and purposes, expressed this interest in linking climate change to migration, in understanding that better and bringing it into its refugee policy, but it's really gone nowhere with it for almost close to a year. It'll be soon. And you know, there's been a lot of like political interest, but obviously no political will. Maybe Todd, you might say there's been political will to, the climate action has really been about border enforcement, right? So if these are sort of where there's interest, but then the action is really about keeping people out, what should our priority be to educate the US public? Because I think you're all saying things that they don't seem to know, which is unfathomable to me, but in my own experience, I know that that's true. I'll leave that. Jorge, maybe do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is the way that, you know, Canadians in solidarity with Central Americans and Salvadorans specifically help support the struggle against metallic mining in the region. And that was a kind of critical, it actually offers a kind of model, a political model of solidarity with, you know, sort of global North populations who are usually the beneficiaries of these economic and exploitative imbalances, and supporting movements on the ground who are experiencing the most acute effects of ecological crisis. And these are people who are, you know, are in the front lines, are often being intimidated. There's folks who in that struggle were disappeared and harmed. So these are folks really who are kind of putting their bodies on the line to assert their autonomy to remain in place and the right to remain. And so I think that you know, 2017 moment where El Salvador banned metallic mining as a result of these water defenders and these anti-mining activists couldn't have been possible without the pressure that Canadians and North American activists were putting on Pacific Rim Corporation, Oceana Gold, right? And really doing that work that one can do as being internal to, you know, sort of global North nations to make those sort of expressions of you know, this brutality that's happening in the region present in the halls of power within Canada or the US. So that to me is a kind of one form. And then building on something that José said about this Milpa thing is kind of in my head, but I think Milpa also offers a kind of organizational model where we can all coexist and sort of nourish one another. I think that's kind of a beautiful a way to frame what it's going to take to put these issues on the table and keep them there, right?
Yeah, agreed. You know, I was saying we come back to this just the right to stay. You know, it's more than just migrating, not migrating, right? To me, right to stay. In so many of the things, beautiful things that you've all been saying, and to your point, Anne, about a new economy, and to what you just said, Jorge, I think, you know, you're right. I think we need like a people's movement, and maybe that is where we're going with some of the, not only young, but some of the, you know, younger leaders that you're seeing in the climate movement. I, for sure, never ever expected this conversation that we're having now to be happening in 2022. When I convened or founded Climate Refugees, I fully expected, you know, that was in 2015. I fully expected it to be 20 years down the road that policymakers would be forced to have to talk about this. So I think the climate tipping points are forcing us to talk about it. But then also to your point about a movement, it's like the right to stay. You're also seeing that manifest in economies where a lot of young people are saying, I don't want to purchase and partake in an economy the way it has been, which is highly extractive, which is highly individualized, you know. So I think that these things, unfortunately, they might still like have their greatest push when we come to like, you know, a real like tense moment. But I think that they're really hopeful things that you've all said, which I want to uplift, because maybe that's a really good hopeful note to leave it on, and turn it over to Bob, because we could go on and on about some of the very negative work or negative things and negative scenarios in which we're in. I will just finally conclude though by saying that one of our great panelists made the point about you know, we're talking about this as a whole region. I think it was you, Jose. It's not just Central Americans, although we have seen for 22 years, right? We have 22 years of numbers, and we have seen a steady uptick, the highest numbers of Central American arrivals, right? In March, Cuba and Colombia are some of the highest numbers you've ever seen, and they're higher than Central America. And that, I think, really speaks to what you just had to say, Jose, what you've had to say, Jorge. You know, it speaks to the economic policies, it speaks to the climate policies, because that is exactly what I meant by this multi-causal. It's not like climate change is working all by itself to force people. It's the NAFTA, it's the CAFTA, it's all of these things coming together. It's the border security, it's the externalization of borders and pushing people, you know, who borders don't begin even at the US southern border, right? So there's a lot of intersecting work that I think you're all doing on, and I, for one, agree and uplift of everything you've all said about all of us working together. So thank you for this incredible honor. Thank you for giving us all this opportunity to hear your incredible work. All the links are on the PDF flyer as well as in the chat. Please support these amazing advocates and their work and their organizations. I will turn it over to Bob, I believe. Is that right, Laura? Or do I turn it over to Laura? I'll let Laura take it from there and make sure that the right closing remarks are provided from the Zooming for the Border Collective. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you. No, it's going to be Bob.
Okay.
Okay, he's going to do the conclusion.
Great. So Bob will give us a conclusion. We'll speak to us about Zooming for the Border Collective, and we'll have some final closing remarks. Bob, hopefully I see you here on my screen. May I turn it over to you? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank all the panelists for their wonderful presentations. You've given us all a lot to think about, a lot to move forward on. Mainly, I just want to let everyone know that our next panel discussion will be May 12th at 10 a.m. Pacific, and we'll be getting out information about that. In that one, we'll take a look at the political and economic conditions in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, and how U.S. policy has contributed to those conditions, and how those conditions are driving northward migration, and what the Biden administration has or has not done to improve conditions in that region, and what it should be doing. And so we're pulling together a really good panel on that, and we'll be getting information out about that. And I hope you'll all be able to join us, and I hope you'll tell your friends and colleagues about it. We put this Zooming to the Border Collective together a couple of years ago, precisely because of the conditions that had become so painfully clear along the southern border about the conditions of migrants and refugees, and we wanted to have these kinds of gatherings to get as much information out as we can, and to help mobilize the American people to put some pressure on their government to do something about it. So with that, I just want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And I also want to thank Andrea for the fabulous translation services. I hope we weren't speaking too fast. I know that that's, gosh, it's got to be impossible work. So thank you so much for doing that. I think I see a comment in here from you as well. I might have missed. Anything you'd like to add, Andrea?
Well,
Nope.
nope.
Okay. Well, we have a few minutes. If anyone has any closing remarks, or Laura, if I may leave it with you, or I'd be happy to elaborate as well.
Yes. Well, I just want to say that, I mean, this was a great presentation, and I think all the speakers really gave us a picture of what's going on, and it's so important to get this information out. So what we're gonna do is we are gonna put the videotapes in the websites, Tribuno del Pueblo and People's Tribune, and we also have a YouTube where we put in the videos there so people can have access to it. But we need a little bit of money. So if you guys can make a donation, we need it so that we can have the translations of the transcript, so that when people see it, they can also see it in English and read the Spanish, or vice versa. And so if you can make a donation, I also think that would help. Some of the ideas that you have put down on the web, on the chat, about maybe having another caravan or this and that, whatever, I think that's something that we can discuss with the group, zooming to the border and see. I mean, maybe it be possible, maybe not. It's a good idea, but we'll discuss it, and certainly reach out to you again. So thank you for coming, and let's get this information out. It needs to get out, and let's get prepared for May 23rd, when Title 42 ends, and we know there's going to be a lot of shit happening. I mean, well, there's no kids, but anyway, it's going to be awful. I mean, you know, but I also agree with Jose. We gotta give hope. If we don't have hope, why are we fighting? Why are we struggling? So I totally agree with Jose. We have to have hope and a vision of where we can have a better world. So thank you. And Elana was one of the organizers of this panel. I don't know if you want to say anything, Elana. You're on mute.
Oh. Yeah, I'm here. I just wanted to thank everybody. I think this panel couldn't have gone any better than we had hoped. This incredible range of but connection between just all the complex factors that go into understanding this sort of new term, climate refugee, and what does that mean? It means so very much. And, you know, from Todd's discussion of US policy documents and security documents, to Jose's discussion of the 30-pound, 40-pound children that have to be carried thousands of miles, to, you know, the intricate understanding of how free trade agreements like CAFTA and NAFTA impact people's ability to sustain themselves in their homelands and on the lands that generations have lived on and farmed. You know, it's just together with Amali's just remarkable capacity to weave all of this together and to think about this in terms of the broader issues of human rights was really just really inspiring. And Jose, sign us up for that delegation.
Yes.
Thank you all so much.
Absolutely. Ilana, Laura, Bob, Pedro, thank you so much. I've put the Zoom, in the chat, the link where people can support the video initiatives. I think that's the peoplestribune.org, right? Is that where people can go to support?
Sure. yes.
Okay, there you go. That is the link where you can support this work, which is incredibly important. I learned about it because of your Zooming to the Border collectives. That was in a booklet that Pedro gave me, I think over a year ago now. So I'm really honored to have met all of you. I'll just close it out with 5 seconds, which is to say, the dynamics of displacement have changed. The global powers want us to abide by definitions that really didn't even work in 1951. They certainly don't work today. And that's why they come up with terms like economic refugees, economic migrants. That's why they don't define the term migrant in any legal basis. That's why we have things that are non-binding and soft law when we have more migrants than we do even refugees. That's why we have these invisible lines like voluntary and involuntary and forced movements and non-forced movements. It's all a systemic struggle of the global North oppressing the global South. It has been the way it is. It has been the way it was, and it just cannot go on. The planet is now telling us that this entire system that a very small group of people have perpetrated upon all of us and have oppressed all of us is not sustainable.
That's right.
That should give us all a lot of hope. That might be bleak, but I find that in speaking such truth, and it's a cliche, truth to power, but it's not a cliche. I think in speaking such truth, it gives me hope to hear other people say it. And that's the only reason I'm now doing it, right? Because really fantastic people said these things to me. It helped me become who I am. I've just heard 4, 5, 6 people who I'm now going to put in my column of heroes, So I think we all just need to keep saying these things out loud because they are the truth. And we just cannot let a few dictate the terms for the many anymore. So collectively, there's a lot of will, and there's certainty there in hope and change. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. Thank you for the incredible work that you do. Thank you for the honor of being a part of it, and I can't wait to collaborate and see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You don't want to leave.
I don't either. I'm super jet lagged, but I don't either.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. I'll be in touch.
Good to meet you all.
Muchas gracias.
Bye.
Gracias. Bye.
Take care.
Adios.
Adios.
Adios.